The moment Irene Grayson stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1874, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made either the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish one, and she was not entirely sure which. Dust rose in lazy spirals around her worn leather boots, and the sun pressed down on her shoulders like a warm and insistent hand. She carried a single canvas bag that held everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, a silver-framed photograph of her mother, a Bible her father had given her before he passed, and a small tin box containing $47, which was precisely $47 more than she had expected to have when she left Cincinnati 3 weeks ago. The rest of what she had owned had been sold to settle debts that were not truly hers to begin with, the lingering financial wreckage left behind by a man named Gerald Prout, to whom she had once been engaged, and who had, without so much as a farewell note, cleaned out the small savings account at the First National Bank of Cincinnati, and disappeared west with a woman named Clara Boone. So west Irene had gone too, not chasing Gerald, not for anything as low as revenge, but because there was simply nothing left in Cincinnati to hold her. Her mother was gone, her father was gone, and the small house on Meridian Street had been reclaimed by the bank. A notice had appeared in the Cincinnati Enquirer, placed by a woman named Dolores Hannigan, who ran a boarding house and small restaurant in Dusty Creek, and was in desperate need of a capable woman who could cook, keep books, and manage the daily chaos of a frontier establishment. The pay was modest but included room and board, and Irene, who could cook exceptionally well and who had a sharp head for figures, had written a letter that very afternoon. She had arrived. Dusty Creek was not an impressive place at first glance. There was one main street, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other with a comfortable margin, lined on either side with wooden-fronted buildings that bore the optimistic signs of civilization. A general store, a telegraph office, a barber, a livery, a doctor's office, a small church whose white paint was peeling in long strips like sunburned skin, and at the far end with a hand-painted sign that read Hannigans Establishment, MEALS, ROOMS, Good Coffee, the place Irene was looking for. She squared her shoulders, picked up her bag, and walked. She had not taken more than 15 steps down the main street when a horse came barreling around the corner of the livery at a speed that suggested its rider had either completely lost control of the animal or was the most recklessly confident horseman she had ever witnessed. The horse, a massive chestnut with a white blaze down its face, skidded on the packed dirt and came to an abrupt, ungainly stop not 6 feet from where Irene stood, and she, to her credit, did not scream. She stepped back 1 pace, held her bag firmly against her side, and looked up at the man on the horse with an expression that she hoped conveyed calm disapproval rather than the terror that had briefly seized her heart. The man on the horse was tall even in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly under the brim of a battered brown hat. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock as the bluffs north of town, and dark eyes that were currently wide with what appeared to be genuine alarm. He had not intended to nearly run her down. That much was evident. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and a little rough at the edges like gravel smoothed by a riverbed, "I am deeply sorry. Ranger got spooked by a rattler back there and I was fighting to turn him. Are you hurt?" "I am not," Irene said, and her own voice came out steadier than she felt, "though not through any particular skill on your part." The man had the grace to look embarrassed. He swung down from the saddle in a single fluid motion and held his hat in his hands, and she could see now that he was perhaps 28 or 29, sun-darkened, with a few days' worth of dark stubble across that carved jaw and the kind of lean, hard-worked look that belonged to men who spent their lives outside. "Monroe Carver," he said, extending one hand. "I work the Double C Ranch northeast of town, and I truly am sorry, miss. Are you visiting someone here?" "Irene Grayson," she said, and shook his hand once firmly, the way her father had taught her. "I am not visiting. I have come to work for Dolores Hannigan." Something shifted in his expression, a small flicker of surprise followed by what she might have called relief, though she could not imagine why. "Mrs. Hannigan is a good woman," he said. "She runs a fine establishment. You will be well treated there." "I intend to treat myself well regardless," Irene said, and he blinked, and then the corner of his mouth turned up in a way that she found, against her better judgment, rather charming. "I believe that," he said. He settled his hat back on his head. "Welcome to Dusty Creek, Miss Grayson. I hope the town treats you better than I just did." He swung back up onto the horse with that same easy grace, touched the brim of his hat, and rode on, and Irene watched him go for just a moment before she picked up her bag and continued toward Hannigan's establishment. Dolores Hannigan was exactly what her advertisement had suggested. A capable, no-nonsense woman of about 50, with iron-gray hair pinned severely at the back of her head and quick blue eyes that missed nothing. She welcomed Irene with a brisk handshake, showed her to a small but clean room at the back of the upper floor with a window that looked out onto the alley, and beyond that, the open desert stretching toward the mountains, and she sat down at the kitchen table with Irene that very first evening and laid out exactly what was expected. "I need someone in the kitchen from 5 in the morning until noon," Dolores said. "Breakfast and the midday meal. In the afternoons, I need the books kept and the supply orders written. I am a good cook but a terrible hand with figures, and the suppliers in Santa Fe have been overcharging me for 2 years because they know it. Can you manage that?" "I can," Irene said. "Good." Dolores set a cup of coffee in front of her that was strong enough to strip paint. "You will find that Dusty Creek is a decent town, mostly. There are rough men as there are everywhere, but Sheriff Tate keeps good order. The ranch hands from the Double C and the Rays spread come in on Friday and Saturday nights, and that is when things can get lively, but we do not serve whiskey here, so the truly rowdy ones go to the Dusty Creek saloon down the block and leave us in peace." Irene thought of the man on the chestnut horse. "Do the men from the Double C ranch cause trouble?" Dolores gave her a sharp look. "Monroe Carver's outfit. No. Monroe runs a clean operation. His boys are respectful enough. He eats breakfast here most mornings when he is in town, which is 2 or 3 times a week. He is one of my best customers, and I will not hear a word against him." She paused. "Did something happen?" "His horse nearly knocked me flat when I arrived," Irene said. Dolores made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That would be Ranger. Monroe has been trying to gentle that horse for 6 months. He apologized, I assume." "He did." "Good." "He is a decent man, Monroe Carver. Lost his father 2 years ago and has been running the Double C alone since. It is a lot of land for one man to manage, even with hired hands." Irene nodded, not entirely sure why she had asked, and finished her coffee, and went to bed in her small, clean room and listened to the desert wind moving around the corners of the building, which sounded utterly unlike anything she had ever heard in Cincinnati, and fell asleep to it anyway. She was in the kitchen at 4:30 the next morning, having learned the layout the evening before, and by the time Dolores arrived at 5, Irene had the fire going in the large iron stove, water on to boil, and had begun mixing the first batch of biscuits. Dolores stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. "Well," she said. "I could not sleep past 4, Irene said. "I hope you do not mind." "Mind?" Dolores tied her apron with a firm motion. "I think I may raise your wages." The morning rush at Hannigan's was not a rush so much as a steady, purposeful stream of miners, ranch hands, the telegraph operator, the barber, 2 of the schoolteacher's boarders, and several men whose occupations Irene could not immediately determine. She moved between the kitchen and the dining room with practiced efficiency, keeping the coffee hot and the biscuits coming, and she learned names quickly, because she had always found that learning someone's name was the most basic courtesy you could extend to a person, and also, practically speaking, it made the work considerably easier. Monroe Carver came in at 7:30, which she noted because it was the same time he would come in every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the next several weeks. He always took the same table, the one by the window on the left side, where he could see both the front door and the street, which Irene eventually recognized as the habit of a man who liked to know what was coming. He always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs, biscuits, and a full pot of coffee, and he always left a coin on the table beyond the price of his meal, which she suspected was a tip, though she had never in her professional life been in a position to receive one. The first time she brought his order to the table, he looked up at her with those dark eyes and said, "Miss Grayson, I see Mrs. Hannigan found herself a good one." "I found myself a situation," Irene corrected pleasantly. "I am glad it suits us both." He smiled at that, and she went back to the kitchen. The second time he came in, he said, "How are you settling in?" "Well enough," she said. The third time he said, "Do you ride?" She looked at him, pouring his coffee. "I have not had much occasion to." "This is New Mexico territory," he said, not unkindly. "There will be occasion." The fourth time, which was a Thursday 2 weeks after her arrival, he stayed later than usual, and when the dining room had emptied and dolers had gone to the back to begin inventory, Irene sat down across from him with her own cup of coffee because her feet ached, and because the invitation seemed to be there, unspoken and patient, waiting for her to accept it. They talked for nearly an hour. She learned that the Double C had been started by his father, Charles Carver, who had come to New Mexico from Tennessee in 1852 and had spent 20 years building something out of nothing. Monroe had grown up on that land, had never wanted to be anywhere else, and had taken it over after his father's death with a combination of grief and determination that had made the first year very hard and the second year only marginally better. He had 12 hired men, about 200 head of cattle, and a stretch of land along the Silo River that produced good grass when the rains came, which was not always. She told him, in turn, about Cincinnati, about the house on Meridian Street, about her father who had been a schoolteacher, and who had read to her every evening from whatever he was reading himself, which had given her an eclectic and slightly unusual education. She did not tell him about Gerald Prout. She was not ready for that, and she was not sure she ever would be. He listened the way that men who were comfortable in their own skin listened, without rushing to fill silences, without performing interest he did not feel. He simply listened, and she found that disarming in a way she had not anticipated. Walking back through the kitchen afterward, Dolers gave her a look that contained a significant amount of meaning in very little facial movement. "We were talking," Irene said. "Of course you were," said Dolers, and went back to her inventory. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Irene found that she was genuinely happy in the work, which surprised her a little because she had expected to feel the strangeness and isolation of the frontier more sharply. But there was something in the directness of the place, in the way people needed things and were honest about needing them, that suited a part of her character she had not previously known was looking for an outlet. She reorganized Dolers' supply orders within the first month, and saved the establishment nearly $12 on the monthly Santa Fe account. Dolers was so pleased that she raised Irene's wages by exactly the amount she had promised herself she would raise them when she found the right person, and she told anyone who would listen that Irene Grayson was the best thing that had happened to Hannigan's establishment since she had purchased the property. There was one thing that troubled Irene, and she turned it over in her mind for some time before she let it settle into the category of things she would have to address eventually. The man who owned the saloon at the end of the street was named Dale Fitch. He was perhaps 45, with a wide, flat face and small eyes the color of dirty water, and he had taken it into his head within Irene's first week in town that she was a woman who needed looking after, by which he meant, as she quickly understood, that he felt she should accept his attentions and his self-appointed authority over her choices. He was not dangerous in the way that some men were dangerous, not violent or openly threatening, but he was persistent in a way that she found exhausting, stopping to speak to her whenever she was in the street, suggesting that a woman of her quality should not be working in a kitchen, implying without quite saying that he could offer her something better if she was willing to consider it. She was not willing to consider it. She told him so, politely and then firmly, and he received each refusal with a smile that did not reach his dirty water eyes and a comment to the effect that she would come around eventually, which she found both condescending and irritating. She had not mentioned it to Monroe. It was her concern to manage, not his, and she was managing it. But Dusty Creek was a small town, and Monroe Carver apparently had eyes that worked. On a Friday morning in mid-June, nearly 7 weeks after Irene's arrival, Monroe came in for breakfast and sat down and waited until she brought his coffee before he said quietly, "I saw Dale Fitch talking to you in the street yesterday afternoon, for quite a while. He is persistent," she said. Monroe's jaw tightened slightly. "Has he been bothering you?" "I am handling it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I know you are. I just want to know if you need any help handling it." She considered him. He was not asking out of the reflexive male assumption that she could not manage herself. There was something specific and attentive in the question, something that had to do with respect rather than authority, and she recognized the difference. "Not yet," she said, "but I will tell you if that changes." He nodded once, satisfied, and she went back to the kitchen feeling something warm had been placed somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum. The following Sunday, Monroe arrived at Hannigan's not for breakfast, but for something entirely different. Irene was in the small garden behind the building, beating dust out of a rug she had draped over the fence, when he came around the corner of the building leading Ranger and a smaller, gentler-looking gray mare. "I thought you might like to see some of the territory," he said, and the hat was in his hands again, which she was coming to recognize as a sign that he was uncertain, which she also found disarming. This man who was entirely certain about almost everything else being uncertain about this. "If you are not otherwise occupied." She looked at the gray mare, and then at him, and made the decision that felt, she would later think, like stepping off a ledge she had been standing on for weeks without knowing it. "Give me 10 minutes to change," she said. He waited in the shade of the building with the horses, and she went upstairs and put on her second dress, the lighter one, and took her hair down and repinned it more carefully, and then caught herself doing that and repinned it the same way it had been and went back down. They rode north out of Dusty Creek, along a trail that curved up and away from the flat of the valley into the foothills where the scrub gave way to juniper and pinon, and the view opened up in every direction into something so vast and so purely itself that Irene stopped talking in the middle of a sentence and simply looked. "The first time I saw it from up here," Monroe said, "I was 7 years old. My father brought me up after the fall roundup. I remember thinking that I had never understood the word big before that day." "I had never understood it either," Irene said, "not until right now." They sat their horses side by side on a flat shelf of rock above the valley, and the wind came in from the northwest carrying the smell of grass and something mineral and clean, and Dusty Creek below them looked very small and very human and very brave, this collection of wooden buildings and human effort in the middle of all that wild, enormous land. "Does it ever frighten you?" she asked. "All of it. The responsibility of it." He thought about that which she liked. He did not answer immediately just to fill the space. "Sometimes," he said, "but it was my father's life and it is mine, and I think the fear is just part of the love for it. They are not separate things." She thought of Cincinnati, of the house on Meridian Street that had ceased to be hers, of Gerald Prout who had taken what was not his to take and left her with the ashes of a life she had thought she was building. She thought about fear and love being the same thing, not separate. "That is a wise way to think about it," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "Did someone teach you how to give a compliment like it is barely a compliment?" She laughed, and the sound of it surprised them both, full and genuine, carried off by the wind. "My father," she said. "He was a school teacher. He thought precise language was the highest form of respect." "I like the sound of him," Monroe said. "He would have liked this," she said, and meant the land, the sky, all of it, and thought, but did not say, that she suspected he would have liked Monroe Carver too. They rode back to town in the long gold afternoon, and Monroe saw her to the door of Hannigan's establishment and touched his hat and said he would see her Thursday, and she said she expected so, and went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands for a moment, not because she was sad, but because she was overwhelmed by something she had no immediately available word for, something that felt a great deal like the beginning of everything. Dolores came in from the dining room, took one look at her and said, "Ma'am," with enormous satisfaction and went back out again. Through the rest of June and into July, they fell into each other slowly and then all at once, the way that things in the desert happen, long dry patience and then sudden and overwhelming bloom. Monroe began appearing at Hannigan's not only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but on other days too, sometimes for a meal, sometimes to help with a repair that Dolores needed done, sometimes simply to stand at the counter and talk to Irene while she worked, which Dolores permitted with a graciousness that was barely disguised smugness. He told her about the Double C, about the individual characters of his hired men, about the particular stubbornness of a longhorn steer that had been escaping its pen twice a week for 3 months, and which Monroe had by now accepted as a permanent feature of ranch life rather than a problem to be solved. He told her about the land along the Silo River, about the way it looked in the spring when the snow ran off the mountains and the grass came in green and thick, and every living thing seemed to remember what hope felt like. She told him more, too, as the weeks went on. She told him about her mother, who had died of a fever when Irene was 12, and who had been quiet and steady and entirely fearless in the way that small women sometimes were. She told him about her father's schoolroom, about the way education had been the framework of her childhood, the organizing principle around which everything else had arranged itself. She told him, one warm July evening on the bench outside Hannigan's front door while the rest of the town settled into its nighttime rhythms, about Gerald Prout. She told it plainly and without sentiment. She had trusted a man who had proven untrustworthy, had been made a fool of in the eyes of Cincinnati society, had lost her financial footing and her home, and had packed what was left and come west, and she was not ashamed of any of it. She had done nothing wrong. The shame belonged to someone else. Monroe listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The man who did that to you is going to spend the rest of his life knowing he left behind something he was not good enough to keep." She looked at him in the last of the evening light. "That is either the most comforting or the most alarming thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I mean every word of it," he said, quietly and with a steadiness that went through her like a current. She believed him. That was the thing she was not prepared for, how much she believed him. In mid-July, there was a problem at the Double C that required Monroe's full attention for nearly 2 weeks. A section of fence along the river property had been deliberately cut, and close to 30 head of cattle had been scattered into the rough country to the north. The hands spent those 2 weeks recovering the cattle and making repairs, and Monroe was out at dawn and not back until after dark, and Irene did not see him for 11 days, which she noticed with a precision that told her a great deal about where her heart had arrived without her conscious permission. When he came back into Hannigan's on a Tuesday morning, thinner and darker from the sun, and with a weariness in his face that had not been there before, he sat down at his usual table and looked up at her and said, "It is good to see you, Irene." And it was the first time he had used her first name, and the sound of it in his low gravel voice was like water on dry ground. "Who cut the fence?" she asked, setting his coffee down. His expression shifted. "I believe it was Fitch." She stared at him. "Dale Fitch. He has been trying to buy the river pasture from me for 2 years. I have told him no every time. He wants to build a second saloon up there where the cattle drive trail passes through, and he needs the water access." Monroe wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I cannot prove it was him, not definitively. But the cut was on the side of the property closest to the trail, and 2 of my men saw one of Fitch's boys riding that road the day before we found it." Irene sat down across from him, something she had long since stopped asking permission to do. "What will you do?" "Fix the fence, keep watching, talk to Sheriff Tate." He looked at her. "What I will not do is give him the land. That pasture was the first piece my father ever bought. He worked 3 years in Tennessee before he had enough to purchase it. I would rather fight Fitch until we are both old men than let that ground go." She understood that completely. She understood the bones of it, the way that some things were not about their monetary value, but about everything that had gone into them and everyone who had wanted them to matter. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his. He looked down at her hand, and then up at her face, and something in his expression settled and opened at the same time, the way a door does when it finally finds its own level. "Thank you," he said. "Eat your breakfast," she said, and went back to the kitchen, and Dolores, who had been visible in the doorway for exactly as long as was necessary, said nothing whatsoever, which was, from Dolores, a very eloquent form of approval. The situation with Dale Fitch did not resolve quickly, because men like Fitch were not built for quick resolutions. He continued his campaign of indirect pressure, spreading words around town that Monroe Carver was struggling to keep the Double C solvent, which was not true, suggesting to the 2 suppliers that serviced the ranch that they might find better business elsewhere, which produced a week of worry before both suppliers made clear they had no interest in Fitch's politics, and continuing his attentions toward Irene with an edge that had become, over the months, something closer to a studied coldness than the original oily warmth, which was in some ways worse because it felt more like a threat and less like a nuisance. One afternoon in early August, Fitch came into Hannigan's and sat down in Monroe's chair by the window and ordered coffee, and when Irene brought it he said, in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "You are making a mistake, Miss Grayson, attaching yourself to a man whose future here is not as secure as he lets on." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I am going to say this once more very clearly, and I would be grateful if you would hear me. I am not attached to anyone by anything other than my own choice, and my own choices are mine to make. Your opinion of Monroe Carver's future is not something I asked for. Your opinion of my choices is not something I require. If you come into this establishment to eat or to drink coffee, you are welcome. If you come in to speak to me about things that are none of your concern, I will ask you to leave, and if you do not leave, I will ask Mrs. Hannigan to speak to Sheriff Tate." Fitch looked at her for a long moment. "You are a hard woman," he said. "I am a precise one," she said, and walked away. She told Monroe that evening, because she had promised she would if things changed, and because she wanted to, which was a different kind of reason and the more important one. They were standing on the bench outside Hannigan's again in the long blue dusk of the August evening, and he listened with his jaw tight and his hands still in his lap. "I want to go down there," and he started. "No," she said. "Not yet. I handled it. I just wanted you to know." He looked at her and the tightness in his jaw softened. "You are the most capable person I have ever met," he said, and it came out rough and honest with nothing practiced about it. "My father would be pleased to hear that," she said. "He would be right to be proud," Monroe said, and then, after a pause that had a quality of gathering in it, "I would like to be—" he stopped, started again. "There is something I want to say, and I want to say it correctly because you are someone who values precision." She turned to look at him fully. "I have been thinking about you since the morning you stepped off that stagecoach and looked at me like I was the most inconvenient thing that had happened to you all day," he said, and his voice was quiet and entirely serious. "And I would like to be a great deal more to you than the man who nearly ran you down, if that is something you would be willing to consider." The evening air was warm and the stars were beginning to come out over the desert, enormous and very close the way they were in New Mexico, and Irene Grayson, who had come west with $47 and a canvas bag and had not expected to find anything except work and a new start, felt the last of the tight, careful guard she had been keeping around herself come quietly loose. "I have been considering it for some time," she said. He smiled then, the full version that she had only glimpsed before, and it changed his entire face, made it younger and warmer and entirely uncomplicated. And he reached out and took her hand with both of his, carefully, like something he intended to keep. They sat there until the stars were fully out, talking about small things and large things and some things that had no category at all. And when Irene finally said goodnight and went inside, Dolores was at the kitchen table with her account books and did not look up from them. But her expression contained more genuine happiness than a woman conducting an inventory had any business displaying. The months that followed were some of the best of Irene's life, and she recognized them as such even while she was living them, which felt like a particular kind of grace. Monroe courted her with a steady, unhurried sincerity that was entirely his own, bringing her books from the supply order he had put into Santa Fe, knowing she would value them, riding with her on Sunday afternoons to places in the territory he knew she had not yet seen, the ruins above the canyon rim, the meadow along the upper silo where elk came in the evenings, the place on the eastern ridge where, on a clear day, you could see into Texas. Sitting across from her in the evenings and listening and talking with equal attention, never making her feel that one was more important than the other. He kissed her for the first time at the end of September, on the eastern ridge on a Sunday afternoon with the whole Texas distance spread out behind her and the wind coming up strong from the south, and it was serious and careful and entirely certain, which was exactly like him, and she held onto the front of his jacket with both hands and was certain back. "I am in love with you," he said, not as a prelude but as a fact. "I know," she said. "I am in love with you too." He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his face that she could not immediately name, a kind of stunned gratitude, as if he had not quite let himself believe it until she said it. "Good," he said very quietly, and she laughed against his shoulder, and he held her there in the wind with his hat threatening to blow off and neither of them doing anything about it. The fall brought the cattle drive, which Monroe had been preparing for since August. The bulk of the Double C herd went south toward the rail connection at Las Cruces, where they would be sold and transported east, and Monroe went with them, because the drive was not something he trusted to anyone else to see through. He was gone for 18 days. He left Irene with a letter in a sealed envelope that he handed to her the morning of the drive's departure, when the street was full of dust and cattle and the sound of men calling to each other. "Open it when you get tired of waiting," he said. "I am already tired of waiting," she told him. He grinned. "Open it tonight, then." She waited until late that night, until Dolores had gone to bed and the establishment was quiet, and she sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and opened the envelope. Inside were 2 pages in Monroe's hand, which was surprisingly careful for a man who worked with his hands, the letters well-formed and deliberate, and they contained, simply and without any particular flourish, a detailed account of why he loved her. Not why she was admirable, not a catalog of her qualities, but specifically and personally why she, Irene Grayson, had become something without which his life was noticeably, continuously, permanently diminished. She read it twice, and then folded it very carefully and put it back in its envelope, and held it with both hands and thought about her father, who had believed that precise language was the highest form of respect, and thought that he had been right, and that Monroe Carver understood that without anyone having told him, and that she was going to be fine and more than fine, and that the desert wind around the corners of this building had been the right sound to fall asleep to all along. He came back in late October, leaner than he had left, and with the drive's money in the bank and a piece of paper in his coat pocket that he did not show her immediately. The evening he returned, he came to Hannigan's for supper and ate with an appetite that suggested the trail cook had been inadequate, and afterward he sat with her on the bench outside in the cool October air and told her about the drive, the river crossing below Socorro, the 2 days of rain, the argument with the buyer in Las Cruces that Monroe had won, the final numbers that were better than he had hoped. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out the paper and held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. "I went to the land office in Las Cruces while I was there," he said. "I have been thinking about this for a while, and the drive settled it in my mind." He looked at her. "I had the deed to the river pasture transferred." She waited. "It is in both our names now," he said, "yours and mine." He handed her the paper and she looked at it, the formal language of a territorial land deed, and there was her name, Irene Grayson, co-owner of record. "I know that is not, I have not asked you yet. The thing I want to ask, I am doing this out of order." She was still looking at the paper. "You put my name on your father's land," she said. "My land," he said. "And I want it to be ours, if you will have me. If you will marry me, Irene, that is what I am asking." She looked up at him, and his face in the October evening was entirely open, without any of the careful management that men sometimes applied to their features when they were afraid of what showing too much would cost them. He was afraid. She could see that. The particular fear of a person who wants something with his whole heart and has not yet been told whether it is possible, but he was not hiding it. She thought of Cincinnati. She thought of $47 and a canvas bag. She thought of the view from the ridge above the valley, the way the land went on and was not frightening once you understood that you were part of it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Monroe, I will marry you." He let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time, and then he pulled her toward him with both arms and held her close in the October air, and she could feel the solid certainty of him and thought, This is what it was supposed to be. This is what it feels like when nothing is wrong." They were married in the small white church in Dusty Creek on the first Saturday in December of 1874, with Dolores Hannigan as Irene's witness and Monroe's ranch foreman, a square-shouldered man named Gil Vasquez, standing up for Monroe. The preacher was a young man named Father Aldridge, who was still growing into the solemnity of his vocation, and who managed the ceremony with enough sincerity to make up for the slight wobble in his voice when he got to the vows. The whole town came, which Irene had not expected but which felt, by the time it was happening, entirely natural. Dusty Creek had been watching this unfold for months with the invested attention of a community that had very little to distract it from the emotional weather of its own members, and it turned out to have strong opinions about the happiness of two of its own. Mrs. Caldwell from the general store brought a cake. The telegraph operator brought a bottle of cider that he had been saving for an occasion of sufficient importance. Even Dale Fitch was absent from his saloon for the duration of the ceremony, whether out of respect or strategic discretion, and the day was clear and cold and brilliant, the sky that impossible New Mexico blue that looked painted. When Monroe put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, and she looked up at him at the altar of the small white church with its peeling paint and its honest aspirations, she felt the last piece of something settle into place, the final stone of a wall that had been slowly, carefully built, and she thought that her father would have been here, and her mother, and that they would have approved, and that was enough. More than enough. That evening at the Double C, Monroe showed her the house for the first time as her home rather than as a guest. It was solid and well-made, a ranch house built for permanence rather than impression, with wide plank floors and windows that caught the afternoon light, and a kitchen that was larger than any she had worked in. There were 2 bedrooms and a good sitting room, and a porch that faced west so that the sunsets were visible in their full theatrical entirety every single evening. She stood in the kitchen and put both hands flat on the table and felt the solidity of it. "It needs things," Monroe said from the doorway, slightly uncertain in the way he was when things mattered. "Whatever you want to do with it, it is your home now." "Our home," she said, and he crossed the room and took her face in his hands and kissed her with the same seriousness and certainty as always. And outside the December wind moved across the open land, and the stars came out in their vast New Mexico multitudes, and the Double C settled into its nighttime quiet around them. The winter passed with the particular intimacy of two people learning the daily geography of each other's lives, the small habits and preferences and rhythms that are only revealed through the close quarters of shared living, and that are, in many ways, the real substance of a life together. Irene learned that Monroe rose before the sun every morning without apparent effort, that he was a better cook than he had admitted, that he had an extensive memory for the details of things he had read and would surface them at unexpected moments in conversation, and that he was capable of a stubbornness that was breathtaking in its cheerful intractability when he felt he was right about something. He learned that she was a lighter sleeper than she appeared, that she had strong opinions about the keeping of accounts that she was entirely willing to impose on any system that did not meet her standards, which included the Double C's bookkeeping, which she reorganized over the course of 3 January afternoons with Monroe's admiring and slightly awed cooperation, and that she could ride a horse with genuine competence now, the gray mare having been hers since that first Sunday in June. She continued working mornings at Hannigan's through the winter because she had made a commitment to Dollar's, and because she genuinely valued the work and the company, and because the establishment needed her, Dollar's having admitted in November that without Irene's management of the books and the supplier negotiations, she had been slowly losing money for 4 years. Monroe had no objection whatsoever. He rode in with her on the mornings she worked and picked her up at noon, and Dollar's fed him breakfast while he waited, and the arrangement suited everyone involved. Dale Fitch made one final attempt to cause trouble in February of 1875. He rode out to the Double C boundary line with 2 of his men and spent an afternoon surveying the river pasture from the road, which was his right as the road was public, but the implication was clear enough. Monroe rode out to meet him at the fence line, and Gil Vasquez and 2 of the hands came along, which was not a threat but was a very specific kind of information. "Beautiful piece of land, Carver," Fitch said from his horse. "It is," Monroe agreed pleasantly. "And it is deeded to my wife and me, jointly through the Territorial Land Office in Las Cruces. If you have questions about the property boundaries, I would encourage you to consult with Sheriff Tate, who has a copy of the deed on file." Fitch looked at him for a long moment and then looked at Gil Vasquez and the 2 hands, who looked back at him without hostility and without backing down, and then he looked at the river pasture, green with the early spring grass coming in, the water moving bright and steady along the property line. "Pretty wife," Fitch said, with the last meanness he had available. "The most remarkable woman I have ever met," Monroe said, without a flicker of anything except complete sincerity, and Fitch, who had not expected that and who had no available response to it, turned his horse and rode back toward town. He made no further moves against the Double C. He sold the saloon in the summer of 1875 and left Dusty Creek entirely, which the town received with the quiet satisfaction of a community that had known for some time that a particular element was not doing it any good. Spring came to the Double C, and the Silo River ran full and cold with snowmelt, and the grass came in exactly as Monroe had described it, green and impossibly tender, covering the wide valley in a color that had no comparison in anything Irene had previously experienced. She stood on the porch one morning in April in the long gold early light and looked at it, and felt something so large and complete that she had to stay very still for a moment to contain it. Monroe came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head, and they stood there together watching the light move across the green valley and the shadows of the clouds running over the hills to the north. "Happy," he said. "Completely," she said. And then, after a moment, "Monroe, I need to tell you something." He went still, the particular stillness of a person bracing for news they cannot predict. She turned in his arms to face him. "We are going to have a baby," she said. The stillness lasted another half a second, and then his face did something she had never quite seen it do before. It went from still to entirely undone, not in a distressed way but in the way that certain moments undo a person by being too large for ordinary expression, and he pulled her close again with a careful intenseness and pressed his face against her hair, and she could feel him shaking slightly, just slightly, with something that was not fear but was its full counterpart. "When?" he managed. "October," she said, "if I am counting correctly." He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "October," he said, like it was a word he was learning the weight of. "October," she confirmed. He laughed then, a short, surprised sound and then a longer one, and he swung her gently and carefully in a half-circle on the porch and she laughed too, and the morning around them was entirely extraordinary in its ordinariness. The sun coming up, the grass green, the river running, the double sea settled and purposeful and alive in every direction. They told Dolores that afternoon. Dolores set down the coffee pot she was holding very carefully and then said, "Well." "Well now," in a voice that had lost all its brisk efficiency and was something else entirely, something softer and deeper, and she embraced Irene with a firmness that communicated everything she was not saying, and then told Monroe with great seriousness that he was going to have to build a second bedroom, to which Monroe said that he already had one, and Dolores said she meant a third one for when they needed it, which she said with a certainty that made Irene laugh. The summer was long and hot and busy, and Irene's days shifted gradually as the months progressed, fewer hours at Hannigan's and more at the Double-C. Overseeing the garden she had started behind the house in early spring, keeping the ranch books, learning from Gil Vasquez's wife, Elena, who lived in the foreman's house at the eastern edge of the property, and who had 4 children and a calm, practical competence with the realities of frontier life that Irene valued enormously. Elena was perhaps 35, a small woman with quick dark eyes and hands that never stopped moving, and she took Irene's situation in hand with a directness that Irene found enormously comforting, because it was offered not as charity or condescension, but as the natural exchange between 2 capable women who recognized each other as such. "The baby will come when it comes," Elena said one afternoon in August, as they sat on the porch of the foreman's house with the children playing in the yard. "Your body knows what to do. Your part is to trust it and not get in its way." "That is easier said than done," Irene said. "Everything good is easier said than done," Elena said, with the comfortable certainty of someone who had lived through enough to know the difference between what mattered and what did not. Monroe was solicitous without being fretful, which was exactly the right combination. He did the things that needed doing without being asked and refrained from treating her as fragile, which she was not, and he came in from the range every evening and sat with her on the west porch while the sun went down, and they talked or were quiet, equally comfortable in both. The baby came on the 14th of October, 1875, during a night that was clear and cold with the first real chill of the autumn, and Elena was there and the doctor from town was there, and Monroe was in the kitchen because Elena had firmly placed him there, and Irene worked through it with the same directed focus she brought to everything difficult. And at just past midnight, the house received its newest occupant with what Irene would later describe as emphatic insistence. Monroe came into the bedroom when Elena opened the door, and he looked at Irene first, a long, searching look that asked the question he did not want to say aloud, and she answered it by looking steadily back at him with a tiredness that was also satisfaction, and then he looked at the child in her arms. A boy. Dark hair, already apparent, Monroe's jaw in miniature already visible, and a pair of lungs that had been making their presence known for several minutes. Monroe sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and Irene watched him looking, and there was nothing in his face that was held back or managed. He was completely there, completely present, completely undone in the best possible way. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He had thought about this. She knew he had because she had seen him thinking about it on several occasions over the past months, going quiet in the middle of other things with the particular inward look of a person working something out. "Charles," he said, "for my father, if that is all right with you." "Charles," she said, and looked at the baby, who looked back with the unfocused ancient gravity of all very new people. "Charles Carver, yes, that is exactly right." Monroe leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, and then very carefully to the forehead of his son, and she held Charles against her and felt the weight of him, this particular, specific, irreplaceable weight that was entirely new in the world, and yet already, impossibly, already felt like something that had always been true. "I love you," Monroe said against her hair. "We love you too," she said, and felt him smile. The years that followed were full. The double C grew, carefully and steadily, the way Monroe did everything, with no more ambition than the land could bear but no less than it could support. Gil Vasquez and his family stayed, and the ranch became something closer to a community than an operation, with the Hands and their families occupying the eastern quarters and sharing in the rhythms of the agricultural year. Irene managed the books with a precision that made her the unofficial financial conscience of the operation, and she had, by 1877, organized a small lending library in the corner of the Hannigans' dining room, stocking it with books she ordered from Santa Fe, and which could be borrowed by any resident of Dusty Creek for as long as they needed, which was the most direct tribute she could pay to her father's belief in education as the most fundamental of courtesies. Dolores Hannigan, watching the library grow, said that Irene Grayson Carver was going to improve this town whether the town liked it or not, which the town largely did. Charles grew from an emphatic infant into an emphatic toddler into a child of 4, who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's precision of expression, and an appetite for questions that suggested he had inherited both of their minds simultaneously and was using them in parallel. In the spring of 1878, Irene told Monroe that there would be a second child in the autumn. Monroe was on the porch splitting firewood when she told him, and he set down the axe and looked at her with that same bright completeness that had been there the first time, not diminished at all, and pulled her close and held her in the morning air. "Charles will have opinions about this," she said, against his shirt. "Charles has opinions about everything," Monroe said. The second child arrived in November of 1878, a girl this time, with Irene's lighter coloring and Monroe's jaw, and a disposition that Alina described within 24 hours of her arrival as deeply determined, which proved accurate. They named her Alice, for Irene's mother. Monroe held Alice on the porch on her first evening in the world, while the sun went down over the western hills, and Charles stood beside him with the solemn intensity of a 4-year-old taking a new responsibility very seriously, and Irene sat in the chair behind them, warm and tired and watching her family from a few feet away, and the view from the porch was the same view it had always been, the hills and the open valley and the great western sky, but it was not the same at all. It was layered now. It contained years and seasons and all the particular weight of things that had been lived in it. She thought of the stagecoach. She thought of the canvas bag with $47 and a Bible and a silver-framed photograph. She thought of stepping into the dust of Dusty Creek's Main Street and looking up at a man on a horse who was looking down at her with genuine alarm and saying he was deeply sorry and introducing himself with his hat in his hands. She thought of all of it, the full, extraordinary, accidental, deliberate, specific course of it, and she could not find a single moment she would have changed, not even the worst ones, because they had all been necessary to arrive here, to this porch, to this particular evening, to Monroe turning from the railing with Alice in his arms and Charles beside him, and looking at her with an expression that contained everything he had ever said to her and a great deal more besides. "What are you thinking?" he said. She smiled at him. "That I stepped off a stagecoach in exactly the right place," she said. He crossed the porch and sat beside her and put his free arm around her shoulders, and Charles leaned against Monroe's knee, and Alice was asleep against his chest, with the complete trust of a new person who had not yet learned that the world could be anything other than exactly this, warm and held and accompanied. The stars came out, one by one and then all at once, over the Double C, over the Silo River, over the Green Valley and the western hills, over the small white church in Dusty Creek with its peeling paint and its aspirations, over Hannigan's establishment where the light was still on in the dining room window and would be for another few hours yet. It was 1878 in New Mexico territory, and the land was wild and enormous and full of everything. And on the west porch of the Double C Ranch house, Irene Grayson Carver leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and listened to the desert wind and felt the weight of her daughter in Monroe's arms and her son's warmth against her side. And everything that had ever been lost was still lost, the way lost things stay, but everything that had been found was here. Present and permanent and entirely, wholly real. Monroe pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Irene," he said. "Monroe," she said, and that was enough. That was precisely and completely enough. The lending library at Hannigan's establishment grew through the following years until it occupied a full wall of the dining room. And in 1880 Irene organized the first formal school committee in Dusty Creek, arguing successfully before the territorial county office for funds to hire a permanent school teacher, which was the beginning of what would eventually become a proper schoolhouse with 2 rooms and a bell tower, though that was still some years off. Monroe was on the committee with her and took notes in his careful handwriting, and said exactly what needed to be said when it needed to be said, and was otherwise content to let Irene lead, which she did with the focused, organized energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of work, without knowing she had been waiting. The Double C continued to do well. The river pasture, the land Monroe's father had come from Tennessee to buy, and which Monroe had put in both their names the autumn he came back from the cattle drive, remained the heart of the operation, the grass along the silo still coming in each spring with that stunning, particular green that Irene had watched from the porch that first April morning, now a sight so familiar that it had become part of the texture of her daily life, which was the very best thing a beautiful thing could become. Charles started school in 1880 at the age of 5, and took to it with the same emphatic insistence he brought to everything, arriving home in the afternoons with more questions than he had left with, which Monroe received with patience and Irene with delight, because the questions were good ones, careful and specific, the questions of someone who actually wanted to know the answers. Alice, at 2, had developed an intense relationship with the gray mare, who was elderly now and gentle beyond her earlier nature, and who tolerated Alice's enthusiastic petting with a placidity that was entirely new. Monroe said Ranger had once been the same way with a barn cat before he decided he disliked cats. Irene said Alice was more persuasive than a barn cat. Monroe said that was almost certainly true. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1881, Monroe and Irene rode out to the Eastern Ridge, the place where the view opened up into Texas on a clear day, the place where he had kissed her for the first time in 1874, with the wind coming up strong from the south. They left Charles with Alina and took Alice on the gray mare, Monroe holding her steady in front of him on the saddle. The view was exactly as it had always been, the land going on and on, the distance immeasurable and precise at the same time. 7 years ago, Irene said. Nearly, Monroe said. 7 years this December. Alice said something in her 2-year-old language that contained the word horse prominently and pointed at the mare, who was standing beside them with the contentment of an animal that had found its calling in not being required to do very much. Yes, Irene agreed. Horse. Monroe looked at her sideways with the corner of his mouth turned up, the way it had turned up that very first morning in the main street of Dusty Creek when she had told him that she had found herself a situation and was glad it suited them both. Irene, he said. Monroe, she said. I am still the luckiest man in New Mexico territory, he said, which was not something he said often, because it was not something he needed to say often, the fact of it being evident in every particular of their daily life together. He said it now because they were on the Eastern Ridge and the distance was all around them, and it seemed like the right time to say things clearly. She looked at him in the October afternoon with their daughter between them and the land their children would grow up on, stretched out in every direction, and said, "I believe the luck was evenly distributed." And he laughed, that full warm sound she had known since that first Sunday ride in the New Mexico hills, and reached out and took her hand across the saddle, careful of Alice, and held it on the walk back down to the valley. Dolores Hannigan retired from active management of the establishment in 1882 and sold it to the couple who had been running the dry goods next door, who had long wanted to expand. She retained her room on the upper floor and spent her time in the garden and on her accounts, and at the Carver table 2 evenings a week for supper, which Monroe and Irene and the children had separately and collectively made clear was a permanent invitation. She was, by her own assessment, perfectly content. She had found, she told Irene one evening in the kitchen while Alice helped Monroe and Charles with something complicated and loud in the sitting room, that the things she had always assumed she was missing had been replaced by things she had not known she could have, which was the better bargain. Irene looked at her across the kitchen table and thought of her own version of that same exchange and smiled. "Yes," she said, "I know exactly what you mean." The winter of 1882 settled over the Double C with the particular clear cold of a New Mexico winter that has decided to be serious about itself. The sky blue and iron-hard, the ground frozen in the mornings but thawed by midday, the mountains to the north capped with white that did not intend to leave until March. Monroe and Irene had added a proper parlor to the house the previous spring, with bookshelves, because the books had been accumulating for years and the sitting room was running out of wall space. And in the evenings after the children were in bed they sat in the parlor, Monroe with the ranch accounts or whatever he was currently reading, Irene with correspondence or her own book, the lamp between them, the fire doing what it was built to do, the house around them solid and full of everything they had put into it. On a Friday evening in December, exactly 8 years to the month from their wedding, Monroe set down what he was reading and looked at her across the lamp. 8 years, he said. She looked up from her book. 8 years, she agreed. I remember the morning you stepped off that stagecoach, he said. I remember thinking before you had said a single word that you were unlike anyone I had ever seen. You thought I was about to cause you trouble, she said. You were, he said with that familiar corner-of-the-mouth smile. The best kind. She set her book down and looked at him in the lamplight. This man she had come to know with the kind of completeness that was only possible through time and proximity and sustained, deliberate attention, who was still 8 years on, capable of surprising her, who was still 8 years on, the specific person she wanted to tell things to first, who was still 8 years on, someone she chose every morning with full knowledge of what she was choosing. Monroe, she said, I would do all of it again. He looked at her for a moment with the full open expression that was his best self, the one he kept for the moments that required it. So would I, he said, every piece of it. Outside, the December wind moved across the Double C in the old way, around the corners of the house, across the dark valley, along the frozen course of the Silo River, over the pasture that Charles Carver Sr. had bought in 1852 from money earned over 3 Tennessee years, and which his son had put in 2 names in a Las Cruces land office in 1874, because he had known, even then, that it was already half hers. Somewhere in the house, Charles stirred in his sleep and went quiet again. Alice was a complete and determined silence in the room next to his. Monroe got up from his chair and crossed the parlor and sat beside Irene on the settle and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she had been leaning into him for 8 years, with the full weight of herself, the full trust of everything she had become in this place, and he held her with the same arms that had always held, steady and certain and entirely present. The lamp burned. The fire settled. The Double C held everything it had ever been given to hold, and the night was quiet and full of stars over New Mexico, and every open thread of their lives was woven in, every piece resolved, every uncertainty answered, every risk rewarded, every loss transformed by everything that had been found. Irene Grayson had stepped off a stagecoach in Dusty Creek in the spring of 1874 with $47 and a canvas bag, and had not known what she was walking toward. She knew now. She had known for 8 years, more solidly and certainly with every season that passed, and the knowing had only deepened and widened like the silo in the spring thaw, making room for everything, containing everything, running clear and bright along the boundaries of the life she had built. This was it. This was all of it. This was, completely and without reservation, home.